everybody, it's Whitney from All the Shelves. Today I am filming my December wrap-up. These are all the books that I read in December. There are a lot of them, so let's get started. In December I started on a big true crime kick. I've been listening to true crime podcasts, I have been reading true crime, I've been listening to true crime audiobooks, I've been watching like forensic files and documentary series like The Staircase. It's my thing right now for whatever reason. It's what I'm really interested in. So I started off the month by reading People Who Eat Darkness by Richard Lloyd Perry. The subtitle is The True Story of a Young Woman Who Vanished from the Streets of Tokyo and the Evil That Swallowed Her Up. What I really like about true crime isn't necessarily the crime itself. I mean, that's part of the fascination and you can't deny that. But what I also like about it is that you get to learn about kind of like the seedy underbellies of cultures, or the kind of fascinating criminal aspects of cultures that you don't really hear about in other mediums as much. In this one's about Japan, and it's all about like hostesses and how in a certain district in Japan, which I'm not going to try to pronounce the name because I would just butcher all of the Japanese pronunciation, but in this certain district they look for American hostesses, which are not prostitutes. They're women who work at clubs so that men can come in and just like talk with them and take them on dates and basically just be propped up by a beautiful woman, you know, in the way that like relationships in a patriarchy kind of work, which is like, you know, if you have a beautiful woman, that signals to everybody else around you that you can afford to have a beautiful woman, that you are powerful enough to have that woman by your side. And that's all hostesses are. So this woman, Lucy Blackman, goes to Japan. She started as an airline flight attendant, that's what it's called now, not stewardess, flight attendant. She started as a flight attendant and she was just getting in so much debt and she needed to get out of debt, so she thought that going to Japan and working for a while might be a good way of doing that. And she and her friend room together in this district and become hostesses, and then suddenly she disappears and her family is completely distraught. Her father and her sister travel to Japan and they start this sort of media frenzy trying to bring attention to her case to find Lucy. And also the mother and the father have like a really fraught relationship. They're divorced and it's like a very bad, messy divorce. So there's like tension going on between the family members. There's tension between the British government and where Lucy Blackman is from and the Japanese government. And because of how the political situation lines up, UK tabloids start paying a lot of attention to this case. And they find the man who is probably responsible in about a third of the book. The end of the book is about his trial, bringing him to justice. So you learn about this district in Japan. You learn about how the governments are working together. You learn about the family dynamics, and then you learn about Japanese legal system. And throughout it all, you learn about Japanese investigative techniques in the police department. So it's just really fascinating. I don't read a lot about Japan, and I learned a ton from People Who Eat Darkness. I listened to this book, American Heiress: The Wild Saga of the Kidnapping, Crimes, and Trial of Patty Hearst by Jeffrey Toobin. This is the author who wrote the book about O.J. Simpson that the recent American Crime Story series was based on. So he's like really meticulous. You can tell just even if you've just watched that series, not read the book. He's very careful about the details. I listened to this one on audio and I think that might have been kind of a mistake. I am very interested in Patty Hearst. This is the woman who was kidnapped by a radical group in the 70s, I want to say. The 70s, called the SLA, Symbionese Liberation Front. They kidnap her and she basically, as she says it, gets brainwashed and she starts participating in the bank robberies, right? So once they find Patty Hearst, then she goes on trial. Was she responsible for her crimes, or was it some kind of like Stockholm Syndrome? What was going on? Stockholm Syndrome wasn't a thing yet, but the basic idea of that. And I'm really interested in that story because of the context of it is fascinating, and these ideas of blame are fascinating, but it's just too detailed. At one point, the example that really I was like, okay, this is too much. At one point he described the shoes that Patty Hearst's lawyer was wearing. I don't know why I need that information except for just to know that Jeffrey Toobin knows his stuff. But by that point I knew that he knew his stuff. Like, I didn't need that reassurance. So it wasn't the best read, but I did learn a lot about Patty Hearst, so I wouldn't say it's a waste by any means. For Christmas, my family went on a vacation to Mexico just to lie on the beach and be in the sun and eat a ridiculous amount of food. It was wonderful. And the whole time I was reading these true crime books, these novels with really dark themes, like I was just like wallowing in darkness while I was enjoying the beach. It was the best. It was like exactly what I wanted. And one of the books I read was called Lost Girls. My glare is crazy, but an unsolved American mystery. This one is by Robert Kolker. This was a story about a series of sex workers that go missing, and how basically when a sex worker goes missing, like nobody pays attention. Even if they do have family members that miss them, like that's always the story. The narrative is like, you can do away with these people, these women, because, you know, nobody's gonna care. But even when they have family members that miss them, it's considered a high risk profession. So it's like, basically you get what you asked for, which is crazy. So this is the story of some of these women that have gone missing and their discovery in a small town, and kind of how the police responded to that discovery, how they proceeded trying to figure out who done it. And this was a very famous case. Eventually they discovered more and more bodies, and they don't know if they're connected or not, or if this is just like some part of the country where people dump the bodies of sex workers. I mean, it's really nuts. The story itself could have been better told. It jumped around a lot between the victims, and it was really hard to keep track of who was who, and maybe that's my fault as the reader, but I think that it could have done with like some little reminders. I was also reading it on Kindle, which made it a problem. Like I couldn't flip back and forth to be like, now who is this again? But all of their stories are so similar, and I think that was part of the point, was to show how each of these victims, they are individuals, but how certain predilections and also challenges in early life could lead to sort of where they ended up. And that's not to place blame on them or to say that where they ended up is, I mean, you get into such like tricky territory when you talk about sex workers, right? And I have a really hard time saying the right thing here. So let me just get back to reviewing the book. I appreciated his focus on the victims, but I felt like it could have been structured better. I read 2 books about Columbine back to back, kind of concurrently. One was Dave Cullen's Columbine. The cover's beautiful, so even though you can't see me right now, you should look at it. It's just really stark and understated. I really like it. This could have been a sensationalist, disgusting recap of every gritty detail, and I feel like it took a writer as careful and empathetic as Dave Cullen to tell this story in a way that was not sensationalist. Even if you don't like true crime, because of that kind of gritty feeling that you might get from it, like feeling like you are getting enjoyment off of something so horrific, this is not one of those books. I would even hesitate. This is more along the lines of like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, rather than like, you know, even like People Who Eat Darkness, like something a little bit tawdry like that. So this one is just about the Columbine shootings. It's about the victims and the killers and all the information that you would want in one story. I learned so much about this that I didn't know. I was in 9th grade when Columbine happened, and as a freshman, that kind of determined what my high school experience was going to be like. Like, this is the beginning of a trend in school shootings, and that became a real fear in school. So I feel like this was sort of my news story, if that makes sense. This was the story that I was fixated on as a kid. And then my senior year, 9/11 happened, and that kind of changed the news cycle for my college years. But this book really challenged a lot of the narratives of Columbine that I was used to hearing, like myths that have been built up around Columbine, and that part is fascinating, why the myths built up, and also which parts of them are true and which parts of them aren't, and why untruths could be so damaging. So that was really good. The other book about Columbine that I read at the same time is A Mother's Reckoning, Living in the Aftermath of Tragedy by Sue Klebold. I was skeptical about this book because I was just worried about it, as I think like everyone was, and in a way that Sue Klebold was very aware of. But then I watched Conrad's review on his channel, which I will link to that review, and he kind of reassured me that it was going to be a thoughtful, kind of beautiful memoir, and it really was. It was interesting to read this alongside the Columbine book because there are still little omissions that you think, now why are you omitting that? And I am not one that's going to be blaming parenting styles, anything like that, but there was a definite focus on mental illness, what Sue Klebold calls brain illness, in a very interesting rhetorical move that Dave Cullen doesn't do away with by any means, but he's much harsher, understandably. And I think what was so interesting about A Mother's Reckoning was watching Sue Klebold really struggle with her love for her son, which she still loves him. Of course she does, she's his mother, right? And she is really grappling with that love in the face of what he did. So it's just really, really interesting. I read a first in a mystery series over my vacation too. It was Elizabeth George's A Great Deliverance. This is the first in the Inspector Lindley series. I was kind of bummed. I had chosen a bunch of books for my Kindle, and then I read through them very quickly. I read about 1,500 pages on a 6-day vacation. I mean, it was absurd. And this was with like family and all of these social things too. I was just reading so much. So I burned through these, and this was the only thing I had left on my Kindle. And I was a little bit like, oh, I didn't really, well, this was sort of a last resort type book, and I've only got these, and I couldn't get internet access, blah, 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 blah. So, I wasn't looking forward to it, and then I ended up really liking it. I thought it was going to be a kind of like country setting, like rural setting, kind of cozy mystery. I've never actually read like an official cozy mystery, but I guess I assumed that would be something, and this would be it. But it's not. It's like the opposite of that. So please don't read this if you're wanting something to like feel good about life. You feel horrible about life with this book, much like the true crime I was reading. I mean, it was a real theme of my trip and a theme of my December, really. And I loved it. It was really good. I'm going to read these Inspector Lindley books. It was well written. It was well paced. I loved the characters. A lot of times in these mysteries, characters go by the wayside, and I felt like the focus was on the mystery as much as it was on developing character, which is a hard balance. So I really liked that. I also read a couple novels in December. One was Noah Hawley's Before the Fall. Here's the cover. You've probably seen this going around because it's fairly new. This was a great vacation read, although it is about a plane crash, which worried me because I am already nervous with flying. It was just really well structured though. And while it maintained a kind of like literary quality, it was also like super accessible, and there are scenes in it that are just utterly compelling. Like I could not stop reading them. Overall, the book has just a lot of really interesting things to say about the relationship between classes. That was the part that I thought was the most interesting. Like it's about the super wealthy and their dependence, both for good and bad, on a lower class, a class that serves them, which is still, you know, in the upper echelons of society. That's the interesting part to me. It's like if you're a nanny to the super rich, you're doing great. You know, you're not a high school teacher, for example, just for a random example. A novel that I read that I had like high hopes for some reason, but really just didn't like that much, was Old Man's War by John Scalzi. Like it's been 3 weeks since I finished this, and already I've forgotten tons of it. I guess I thought it would be more intellectual, like that kind of sci-fi where you're thinking about the ethics of war and the ethics of a, you know, a society where war has extended into a universal platform rather than just a terrestrial one. And like it was more just about like going to war and like boning in new bodies. I mean, it's a story about like people who make the decision to get brand new bodies, but they're gonna have to go fight in this war for 10 years, which they will probably not survive, and who's going to make that decision and who's not. So you could see why that concept's interesting, but it just didn't play out well for me. I thought it was kind of boring in the second half. And the last book that I read in 2016, on the 31st of December mostly, was his Bloody Project. The subtitle is Documents Relating to the Case of Roderick McRae, a historical thriller by Graham McRae Burnett. There's so many little things, little meta things on this cover that already you can see why I would like it, I think. The fact that it's a boy named Roderick McRae who is under investigation, and that the author's middle name is McRae, and he sets it up to be like, this is a story I learned from like a family member when doing like ancestral research. It's a historical thriller though, they're very clear to point that out, and it's funny if you read the flaps, it's like a novel, fictionalized, like they're very careful. Like it's a novel, but it's one of those ones that's set up in documents, which sometimes I hate. Sometimes I really hate that, but this time I really liked it. The one that I didn't like was The Accursed by Joyce Carol Oates. That one was dull, so dull to me, but this one, maybe because it's like, again, it's like true crime, I loved it. So the first part, it's a few accounts of seeing this boy, Roderick McRae, walking through his town covered in blood, carrying 2 weapons, and all of these people in the village see it, and this man, the constable of the village, has been murdered. So it's these first-person accounts of that, and then it gets into Roderick McRae's narrative, which he is writing from a jail cell, and at no point does he deny having committed this act, and so it's just him going through all of the little things that could have led to this act. And then we get into a trial, we get into a psychological evaluation of him, death reports, but the majority of the book is divided in half between his account and the trial. And there's a lot of repetition there, but what I just loved about this book was that that repetition only had slight differences, and those differences were essential enough that it kept you excited. Even when it's repeating so often, you were just devouring this book, I was at least, to find those tiny little differences. And that is an achievement, I think. You know, even in a movie like Groundhog's Day, I get like super bored by the end because we're repeating that narrative over and over, but I didn't here because of the way that they did it and played with narration styles and documentation. It was really cool. This is one of my favorites of the year, spoiler alert to my next video, but it was a finalist for the Man Booker Prize. I didn't hear much about it after I saw it on that list, so if you're interested in historical fiction or crime, issues of blame, issues of psychology and criminality, like, please read this. I would love to talk to somebody about it. And if you've already read it, let me know what you thought, because I loved it. So those are all the books that I read in December, a ton. I had a great reading month. I had a break from school, and I also really prioritized reading for the first time in a while. Like, I just relaxed, and it's snowing, my favorite weather, not only for the lighting being a little bit better, but also just like I feel like wrapped in a blanket of white. It's so nice. It's cheesy as hell. So I'm gonna go before I keep going on and on about snow. So I'll see you guys later.